Hi, everybody. So again, I am Sam Gray. I am in the Masters of Education, the ACTE program. I'm in the online teaching track of this program. I teach eighth grade English at Red Lion Area Junior High School in York. So for my action research paper and my action research plan for this course, what I did was I wanted to look at something that was going to continue to get my students engaged, really kind of hone in on their 21st century skills and skills that they're going to need for their future and for the workforce. So I wanted to figure out what kind of effect blended learning was going to have on my students and in my classroom. So my purpose for my plan was to find ways to engage students because it's something that we all task ourselves with on a daily, if not a secondly basis in our classrooms? Are they more engaged with material when the teaching method includes technology? Does this engagement then lead to more work completion and more success on assignments and assessments and student learning objectives? Lack of engagement, I'm sure we've all experienced, can lead to less work completion, which we then know can lead to a lower academic success rate. So if engagement increases, does student success also increase? And that's really what my purpose was in moving forward with the action research plan that I chose, which was focused around blended learning. So my questions, my research questions for my plan were, I had two of them. How does delivering instructional content via a blended learning format versus a traditional learning format affect student achievement on assessments and assignments? So I had one class that was blended learning, one class that was traditional learning, and how was their achievement on assessments and assignments different? This would be really based on their scores. And then my second research question was, how does delivering instructional content via blended learning versus traditional learning affect student engagement, leading to work completion? It was more than just student engagement here that I needed. I needed to be able to see, does student engagement then affect their work completion? Because that's something that my students struggle with a lot, is getting their work done. The literature that I found that I wanted to really focus on, I had a lot of different literature. Some of it focused specifically on blended learning formats or flipped classrooms. Some of it was more focused on the types of tools that you would use in a blended learning classroom. Some of it was focused on whether or not students even like technology. So the first one that I chose was from a 2018 article, and this is an article that showed that students were choosing digital tools over hard copy tools when interacting with texts. Since my class is an English classroom, we interact with texts all the time. So it was important that I have proof that students are choosing technology, because if I want to do blended learning, they need to want to use that technology. So a quote there was 96 14-year-olds who participated in Low and Son's study use digital reading materials when convenience or ease of access was taken into account. So they were choosing to use those digital reading materials when it was available and when it was convenient. Another article from 2018 that really had a lot of the kind of more closely related to blended learning content that I was looking for. What this article showed was that academic growth is occurring when blended learning is implemented. So these researchers did a pre and a post test, and their pre and post test showed, their post test showed significant growth in learning outcomes from students in the experimental group, which was their blended, and minimal growth from students in their control group, which was the traditional. And this is what I kind of anticipated, but it was also nice to see it confirmed in this study. With these next two articles, these next two pieces of literature, it was really the same thing, that it was very, very honed in on what my research questions were. They focused on engagement leading to success and blended learning causing academic growth. So the 2017 article here on the left was showing that student engagement is improved when blended learning is used. Additionally, student motivation and engagement was increased in the experimental group, which was the blended, at a rate of 44% of student-to-student collaboration and 45% of student-to-teacher interaction. So students are definitely more engaged when blended learning is implemented. And then in the winter article from 2018, academic growth is occurring when blended learning is implemented. And this researcher was able to find that through the use of assessments, projects, homework assignments, that all of these different ways that he was implementing blended learning, it was creating more academically successful students than in the control group. So the way that I originally had planned for this to roll out was that first I was going to implement blended learning into one class through my poetry unit. So I teach 3 blocks. So I have 3 different sets of classes, 3 different sets of students, and I was going to teach one of them in a blended learning capacity and the other with traditional learning. We were going to use the poetry unit for this research. Both classes would get the exact same lessons, the exact same assignments, but it would just be taught through different methods. The second step to that would be then to collect data through assessments and assignments and observations. The data was then going to be used to compare the scores of assessments and assignments between the blended learning and traditional classes. So I would take, let's say I gave a quiz. I would give the blended class their blended quiz, which would be the same questions, but in a blended learning format. And then I would look at those scores compared to the students in the traditional learning format. I chose to do it this way. I know that there were some concerns about like, oh, well, it's a different group of students. It's a different time of day. There are a whole bunch of different risk factors that could go into this data. Absolutely. But every article that I looked at, they had a traditional group and they had an experimental group. They had one class that was receiving traditional learning and one class that was receiving blended, and that's where they were coming up with their data. So I really wanted to mimic basically studies that were already proven. So I would take that data, and then step 2 of that continued. Data would also be used through observations to see if students were engaged in the blended learning class and in the traditional class. I would be able to see this through work completion. I would be able to see it through collaboration. I would be able to see it really just making sure that they were on task and doing what they were supposed to be doing in class. My anticipated findings, I kind of knew a little bit where this was going to go based on the research and based on blended learning that I've done in the past. Basically, what I anticipated was that students taught through blended learning are going to be more engaged with the material. The technology tends to draw them in. And it's fresh, it's new, we're excited about it. So it gets them excited and engaged. That engagement then is going to lead to higher academic achievement. This occurs because students have the resources with them at all times. Many blended resources are digital, so students have access when they need those materials. So because they have those materials whenever they need them, they are going to be more engaged with the material. And like I said, engagement then is going to lead to higher academic achievement. Blended learning also encourages collaboration, which leads to higher student success rates. So we know that a lot of times we encourage our students to kind of talk out what they are thinking about in their head. It's because that out loud vocal conversation about their learning actually helps solidify the content more in their head. So the collaboration leads to communication, which leads to comprehension, higher engagement, higher academic achievement. Blended materials lead to higher work completion, and this is because kind of like on the last page, I said that a lot of blended materials are digital. Students aren't going to be losing their materials as frequently and are therefore going to be completing their work at a higher rate. Their materials can go home with them on their laptop or on their phone or iPad or whatever technology they have. Students have the ability to continuously relearn material. I post videos for my blended classes, so they can go back and access those videos whenever they need to. So that's going to allow them to continue to relearn and really solidify that content. And blended learning can really bridge the gap for middle level students. This is where I see the most success with my students in blended learning. High level students are always going to perform. It doesn't really matter how you teach them. Below level students may struggle with blended learning. It can be too much for them. The technology can be a distraction, but middle level students really thrive on blended learning. I kind of came up with this as I was going through my paper and as I was going through this presentation. It's what I'm going to call my cycle of blended learning. It starts with engagement. Blended learning is more engaging for students. That engagement then leads to work completion, and that work completion is going to lead to academic success. The more academically successful students are, the more likely they are to be engaged, and it creates this nice little cycle, and we get more academically successful students. So my final thoughts, my takeaways from this course, there were a lot of stressful times, um, finding literature, coming up with my research questions, coming up with really even what I wanted to do for my research. That was all relatively stressful. Um, and this whole closure and figuring out what to do from there. This has been a very stressful semester for all of us, but it's led to very successful and insightful outcomes. I've had a lot of time to think about the blended learning and the way that I teach my classes, and I've gotten a lot out of this course. Reflection is key. I said this when we did our paragraph, sentence, word post from a couple of weeks ago. Reflection um, was my word. And I think that that's probably one of the most important aspects of this course. And it's taught me to reflect a lot. Student-centered practices are the goal. We all know this. And I think we all strive to do this, but sometimes it can get lost with everything else that we're expected to do. So just continuing to come back and make sure that student-centered practices are what we're focusing on. And this was a big hurdle for me to get over throughout this. I need to improve on what is working. Just because I'm making changes doesn't mean that I'm doing something wrong or that I'm doing badly at something. I just need to improve on what already works. Moving forward, what I'd like to continue to do is to continue with blended learning. I think it works really, really well. I think that there are times and places where it needs to be tweaked a little bit, but overall, I think it works better for my students and better for me than traditional teaching. I need to figure out how to improve blended learning practices for below level students. Like I said on my last slide, my below level students are typically the ones who struggle the most with blended, and it's because the technology can be a distraction. So I need to figure out how to improve those practices. And I'm not sure how to do that yet, but that's what my next step is. And I need to encourage above level students to challenge themselves through digital tools. Like I said, those high level students, those above level students, they're going to work regardless. But sometimes that's all they do. It's just the bare minimum because they can. They know they're going to be successful. I want to encourage them to take it a step further. Maybe they start developing some lessons or some assessments or some blended tools, something like that. For my district, what I would want to present to them about blended learning is that it's very heavily data driven. There's a ton of data to support blended learning. It also provides an effective mean for collecting data, and we all know how important data is to our schools. So that digital format for a lot of blended learning makes collecting data very streamlined, very efficient, and my district loves data. So that's a big win for them. It also leads to high student engagement, which leads to high student comprehension. And we're trying to teach these kids to the best of our ability and make sure that they're learning everything that they can. So blended learning is encouraging our students to do that. Thank you guys so much for watching and for all of your support and help this semester. I'm looking forward to watching your videos and seeing what you came up with.